Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the American Civil Rights Movement and key Jewish figures in that movement. Hi. And I have to say, I chose this topic because we just finished, February is Black History Month, and Hillel just sponsored at the College of Staten Island an exhibit. Some of you might remember last year you came and you saw the exhibit about the liberation of the concentration camps by American troops. This year we sponsored an exhibit about the Freedom Riders. And around the Freedom Riders, we had a series of lectures and film screenings.
Excuse me, is that Freedom Riders or Freedom Riders?
Could we play? Riders, R-I-D-E-R-S. Freedom Riders. I think the envelope is going around. I think there's an envelope right here. Okay? So, just a brief background. The Freedom Riders were a group of young people, black and white people, who decided that through an organization called CORE, which stands for something like
Racial Equality.
I'm glad you all know. Congress of Racial Equality. So you all, many of you might remember, they joined together to go to take a bus ride, a simple bus ride on the Greyhound buses or Trailways buses. They rode the regular bus companies. They did not charter a bus to go down south and ride in an integrated fashion on the buses throughout states in the South that had not yet who had not yet agreed to follow a law which had been passed by the Supreme Court many years before. And in that group of people were many young Jewish college students. Well, we're going to talk about Andrew Goodman. He actually wasn't a Freedom Rider, but the Freedom Riders came, the first wave, their bus was horribly attacked in Alabama, burned to a crisp by the Ku Klux Klan. People got out by the skin of their teeth. The mob attacked the bus, locked the people in the bus, and set it on fire. They managed to get out by breaking windows, getting out by the skin of their teeth. And I think it's important to note that these, as I said, were just the Greyhound and the Trailway buses. There were people who just were riding the bus, who hadn't signed on to be Freedom Riders. There's only about 8 to 10 Freedom Riders on the bus. And when one bus was stopped, the students at Fisk College in the South decided to send another bus, and they kept on until Kennedy was forced to send in the National Guard, thank you, and just made their point known. And eventually, as we know, very slowly and painfully, the South did become integrated. As I said, on those buses, there were many Jewish young people who felt it was an important value to participate in the civil rights movement. Did anybody here participate in the civil rights movement in any way? What did you do?
Marched, went to Washington.
And why? What was your motivation?
Equality.
So I think it was felt that it was the right thing to do, especially for people coming from a culture which had been oppressed, which just a generation or two before had fled Europe, or had been who were first generation parents, had been survivors of the Holocaust, and people felt it was the right thing to do. That was the summer of 1961. That was the Freedom Riders with the bus rides, and then came the Freedom Summer in 1964, which is where we come to Andrew Goodman. And Andrew Goodman with his friend Michael Schwerner and James Chaney were part of also a group of young, idealistic students who wanted to go down south to register African Americans for the vote. That was their goal, was to go down and register people for the vote. And at first, things seemed to be going well, but very quickly that they were arrested they were held in jail and then they were released. And when they were released, they thought, okay, we're good, we're out of jail. However, they were ambushed, hijacked. Many of you might remember Mississippi Burning, which is or the story from real life. They were ambushed and hijacked, and the 3 boys were strung up and murdered. So Andrew Goodman and James Chaney and Michael Schwerner, they were 21, 22. They were kids. They were young kids, and they went down south to add their voices to the struggle, and they lost their lives. Andrew Goodman grew up in New York City. He went to Queens College, this is part of the City University of New York, and the Schwerner boys' uncle actually taught at Richmond College. I just learned this, was a professor at Richmond College in those days, so there's a connection, Staten Island connection also. So tragic events which eventually did lead to, slowly but surely, a change in our society, which we still struggle with today, as is evidenced by events of this past fall with Eric Garner and Ferguson. And there's still a lot of inequality and still a lot of anger and rage that's out there, quite obviously. So we've come a long way, baby, but not really long enough. And it's a constant struggle, and a constant struggle with that Jews have always been a part of. The Jewish motivation to be a part of the civil rights movement came from a lot of different places. I already said from a place of having been oppressed, but also from a Jewish sense of obligation to repair the world, make the world a better place, to be a partner with God, and to, create a more just society. So one of the leading stalwarts of that movement in the Jewish community was a rabbi named Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Abraham Joshua Heschel is really the thrust of who I'm going to speak about today. Anybody know anything about Abraham Joshua Heschel?
Well, he marched in Selma, was he in the front line with Martin Luther King?
He marched in Selma, and in fact, did any of you see the movie Selma?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to pass out a handout. They didn't make me enough handouts to share. Take a minute and read the article. So, with the civil rights struggles that are going on today, reflective of what happened this past summer in Ferguson and this past autumn here on Staten Island, this movie Selma, which had to have been in the works prior to that because it's it takes a couple of years to make a movie, was in the process, and happened to come out in a very timely way. However, there was one glaring omission in that movie. I mean, there were several historical anomalies, but the one thing is Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a great and dear friend of Martin Luther King Jr., and a very vocal activist in the civil rights movement, was left out of the scene in the movie in the March on Selma. And Rabbi Heschel died in 1972. His daughter, Susanna Heschel, is a professor at Dartmouth College. She heads up their Jewish Studies department at Dartmouth. And this article interviewed her because she was shocked to find that her father, who had been such a seminal figure on so many different levels, had been left out of the movie. Why? The director, the producers say, well, we are artists. The movie is a work of art. It's not meant to be an historically accurate document. But that doesn't really explain why, does it? No. And there's really no answer out there. Nobody says, well, we just didn't think it was right. We just didn't think he had a place in it. But yet, there is that iconic picture of the March on Selma where we see Rabbi Heschel, because he had long white hair and a big long white beard, and he was in the front row, arm's length, with other clergy people. And in fact, the March on Selma had had been organized by Martin Luther King and fellow clergy people who wanted very much to make it a declaration of faith and a show that faith, all faiths, could not possibly agree with discrimination and segregation and lack of equality. That it was that those basic rights were an antithesis to people of faith. And there were not only Rabbi Heschel, there were some other rabbis, there were Catholic clergy, there were Protestant clergy, there were clergy from the African churches, all who marched with Martin Luther King in the spirit of making that a spiritual event. And one of the things that, one of Abraham Joshua's one of Rabbi Heschel's, to say that, most famous quotes comes after that march, in which he says, "I felt like I was praying with my legs." That participating in that march felt like a prayer to him. That's a pretty powerful thing to say. I think that there's many people in the African American community who do support Jews and who do support Israel, just like every community. However, and I'm getting off on a sideline a little bit, but towards the end of the civil rights movement, who gets involved, which makes a very different impact? Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. And I don't want to really get into that too much, but they moved the civil rights movement from a nonviolent, after the death of Martin Luther King, from a nonviolent movement to really into a violent movement that Black Power, that was much more, I don't want to say aggressive, because a nonviolent movement can be very aggressive nonetheless, even though it's not physically violent. But they moved it in a different direction, which I think ultimately did the African American community more harm than good, because it just and in the end that movement kind of came to a slowdown and a halt because of the intimidation and the philosophy of the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, and what they represented. And actually, Heschel himself was also a very big anti-war activist. His passions were Judaism and Jewish life and Jewish education, particularly adult Jewish education, and the civil rights movement here in America, and the Vietnam War. He was a very loud voice against the Vietnam War. So Heschel's background, Heschel was born in Poland, and he was the son of a family that both his mother and his father had come from very prestigious Hasidic dynasties.
Yes, there were also some older people involved with the civil rights movement. You know, it wasn't predominantly young, agreed, but there was some older people, and the doctrine that the southern states used to justify their segregation was called states' rights.
Right. Well, that's because we do have states' rights in this country. We are we're a federalist, a pragmatic federalism,
Right.
with states, made up of all of our states.
By a Jewish man.
That is true. Jews helped the NAACP start. And what happened, and I'll back up from talking about Heschel for a minute, but what happened kind of encapsulated form, and I'm leaving out details, is that with that Black Power movement, the Black Power movement did not want the help of the white man, regardless whether they were Jewish or Italian or whatever they were. The Black Power movement wanted African Americans to stand on their own 2 feet and take control of their own destinies without the help of the white man. And there became a tension that was aggressive, and this was the period of time in the 60s when many of the Jews who were, who did care about the civil rights movement and who were active and part of it, and by the way, many teachers, as I'm sure you all know, were teaching in schools and trying to make a difference, but there became what was called white flight at the end of the 60s, and as part of that tension, white families began to move out of the urban areas
Called a
and go out to the suburbs and leave the urban areas to the black communities, which then eventually caused, as we know, which we still suffer today, the schools that are in the black neighborhoods are not as high performing. There's, you know, higher crime, poverty, and all that. I mean, we could go in, that could be a year's course, talking about all of that, but all of these things are interconnected. So how did Heschel get to where he wanted to make a difference? So he, as I said, he was the child of of adjoining, thank you so much. He was the child of two dynastic, very well thought of Hasidic families in Poland. And he was very well educated. His father died when he was 9, but he had a very strong traditional yeshiva education. And when he finished with yeshiva, and he was ordained with Orthodox rabbinical ordination, and when he finished that, he went to Berlin. He left Poland, he left Warsaw, went to Berlin to study in the university in Berlin. And in Berlin, he graduated from university and went on to get a higher degree in Jewish and Bible studies. And he worked in Berlin as director of an organization, kind of like a JCC actually, that was dedicated to reaching out to unaffiliated Jews, because we're talking the early 30s now. There were lots of people who were unaffiliated, who had been through the Enlightenment, been enjoying secular lifestyle. He saw his mission as reaching out to the unaffiliated Jewish community and doing adult education and bringing people back to feeling a connection to Judaism. What comes along? The Nazis. And Hitler gets into power. And in the early days, Heschel was deported back to Poland. You know, kicked out of Germany, sent back to Poland. He only remained in Poland for I want to say a couple of years, and through a philanthropist who here in the States, who made it his business to try to get out of Europe as many of the Jewish academians as possible, he was able to come here to the United States. His first job here was working at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, where he met his wife. And he taught there for 5 years, God bless you, until he was offered a post at the Jewish Theological Seminary here in New York on the Upper West Side. And at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he taught Jewish education, he taught mysticism, Jewish mysticism, and he had a reputation for being one of the most erudite minds in thinking about Jewish theology and mysticism and teaching the brass tacks of education and how to educate, how to be an educator. So, and he stayed at the Jewish Theological Seminary then for the rest of his life until 1972. Unfortunately, most of his family perished in the Holocaust. After leaving Poland, in that very first days, which I want to say was probably like 1934, along that, he never ever went back to Europe. He couldn't, and he was invited to come and speak and things like that, and he said, why would I go back? I can't go back there. So he never ever went back to Europe, because Heschel was the type of person who saw God in everything. He was famous for and he is famous for some of his main philosophies, one of which is an idea called radical amazement. Has anyone ever heard that term? Radical amazement. What do you think it means?
I think it has to do with everything that you see and touch and deal with is amazing, because it's God's creation.
That's right. Exactly it. He his philosophy was, is you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes and you're amazed at all that is around you. That you're here, that you have a body, that you have love in your life, that there's such a thing as a comfortable chair to sit in, that you can look out the window and see the trees, and he loved nature. He would walk every single day in Riverside Park, and one of his main things that fascinated him and that amazed him constantly were trees. The trees, the way the Hudson looked on any given day. And I don't know if any of you have ever noticed it. I have noticed it even before I really knew about Heschel. When I was studying at JTS, I would drive up there every morning. And if you go up there early in the morning, like if I had an early class, the Hudson on many days is like glass. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. It's just beautiful. The sun is on the Hudson. The Palisades are shining. The GW, and there's trees that just look gorgeous. And that was Heschel. Heschel saw spiritual connection in everything and in every person. He found holiness in everything and in every person, which was why he could not abide by inequalities in our society or war. War really, he was very disturbed by the Vietnam War and images of the Vietnam War.
Well, let me tell you one thing about the war. I served 2 tours, and when this newspaper says, when your nation calls you to serve, you serve, that's the reason I went. They said, the draft card burnings, the riots, your nation calls you to serve, you serve. That always stayed with me.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, I have to say I was young in the Vietnam War. My dad was in the Navy, and we were stationed in Japan. And my father is a doctor, and the soldiers, very wounded soldiers, would be airlifted from Vietnam to Japan for treatment. I don't remember, as a young child, I don't remember what I know of it comes from reading and learning, and the last vestiges in the 70s of the protests. So I do know that when people came back from the war, when the soldiers came back from the war, they were maligned in this country, and people did assign blame to individuals for having participated in the war, which isn't really, I think now that people realize that that's a wrong thinking, but I think it was a painful chapter in American history. Every era of history has its positive, good things that we can feel good about and achieve, and its bad things that we can feel sad about and wish had been done differently, So the 60s, one of the things that we could feel good about that we achieved was really significant movement and progression in civil rights for people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities, and also women's rights. This was also, remember the days of Betty Friedan, and raising awareness for women's rights. And listen, life is hard. Growing up is hard. There's lessons that we learn all along the way. So Heschel tied in those lessons with living every day, and he is really, people really think of him as a really great tzaddik. A tzaddik is a really wise man, someone who doesn't live for himself as much as he lives for others in the world. Any other definitions of what a tzaddik might be? A righteous person. That's the good one-liner. So people really think of him today as a righteous person who really dedicated his life to making a difference. So this idea of radical amazement was one of the things that he wrote about extensively and that he tried to teach. And he really believed that you should get up every morning and just be amazed that you're still here, you're still breathing, you're still alive, you still have friends, which can be hard. When you have to get up early in the morning and your back hurts and your knee hurts and you had a stressful day and all the things that we go through, it can be hard. But Judaism, as a religion, in practice, has built-in methods to remind us to be grateful, to appreciate, and to be amazed. And we're supposed to say a blessing when we get up in the morning. We're supposed to say a blessing when we come out from the bathroom. You know, thanking God that everything works. Because if it didn't, my God, that would be hard. You know, there's something, you know, to appreciate the small things, and that was what Heschel did. And he took it beyond just that, but into an appreciation of the sciences as the sciences proof positive of radical amazement in the world. That you could look at fractals. Everyone know what fractals are? You know, mathematically perfect patterns that occur naturally in nature. If you look at the cells of an orange, or the petals of a flower, it naturally occurring patterns that are so perfect. Although he did warn against deifying nature itself, that radical amazement has to do with finding amazement at God's signature here in the world. Another one of his main things that he worked on, philosophies, was prophecy. You recall 2 weeks ago we spoke about Bob Dylan, and about Bob Dylan being a modern prophet. Heschel studied the ancient biblical prophets extensively, and he not only just studied them from what it was they said and what they were talking about, but from a psychological point of view. Like, who were they? What makes a prophet a prophet? What kind of setup do you have to have in order? I think there's some seats. There's a seat right there. Thank you and welcome. So he was very well known for his work on the prophets, and he felt that to be a prophet, you actually were, as the Bible states, a conduit for God to speak to man. And one of Heschel's most famous books is called God in Search of Man. What's different about that title? It's usually the other way around. Humans are searching for God. Heschel's point, and it's a very dense philosophical work, which I have to admit I can't always. I've tried reading it many times. I don't always get it. But it talks about, basically his idea is that God, the God of the Bible, and he really believes in the God of the Bible, not an energy source as Mordecai Kaplan believed, or things like that, or Martin Buber. He really believes in the God of the Bible, but that God, rather than we always assign human attributes to God, like when we picture God, we have to, in our mind, oftentimes he gets pictured as in a human form, or, but rather, Heschel believed that God had the emotional, the same emotion, that humans and God shared the same emotional capabilities. So that God was always looking for the human. God was searching for what makes us human. Does that make sense? So in other words, what makes us human, in Heschel's eyes, was doing good in the world, making a difference. That was the message of the prophets, that if we, humans should be trying to be better people, should be kind to the poor, should be kind to the widow, should be kind to the orphan. Humans should be, treat the earth with respect, and all of these things that are commandments, mitzvot, that come from the Torah, these are all pathways to a way of being that is godly. So when God feels that humans are not living up to these things, God is always looking for humans to live up to those positive attributes, because those positive attributes are a part of God. Hard to wrap your head around. I told you I've tried to read the book many times, but I kind of get that idea. But that was one of Heschel's main ideas, God in search of man. And it was a different way of thinking in some ways, in other ways not so different from his Hasidic roots, because this is also a very Hasidic way of thinking that, you know, that one, radical amazement, there's joy in everything. Two, that man and God are partners, and that you can attain holiness through different steps of mitzvot, and also there are some people who believe in Kabbalistic method of also attaining that holiness. Another one of Heschel's main ways of thinking was that Judaism has to do with time. That Judaism is a religion of time, and that means not just a theology, a set of ideas, but that in living every day and through the rhythm of life and the cycles of the year and the life cycles and the passage of time, that is how also one way that God is manifested in the world. And he wrote a very famous essay on that called The Sabbath, in which he really talks about how the Sabbath, as an oasis in time set aside from the rest of the week, kind of puts time at a standstill so that humans can then indulge more greatly in radical amazement and in the search, and in when God asked Moses, where are you? Moses answered, I'm here. That the Sabbath in particular is a time when we humans can answer to God, I'm here, we're here. So they're not entirely foreign ideas. All of his ideas come from the Torah, but they were put onto with a modern mystical spin. Heschel had a name for God that nobody else used, and it was called the ineffable. Anybody ever hear that term? Ineffable.
Spell it.
Ineffable. Ineffable. What do you think it means?
God.
That's what he called God, the ineffable. But it means the unexplainable, the unnameable, inexplicable, the thing that you cannot assign any particular hat name to. Ineffable.
Question. I was just wondering, how did he explain the evil in the world that affected the Jews and how the Jews countered it?
That's a good question. And the way he explained it is that man has free will. God has given humans free will, and that God's hope and wish and instruction are that we do good in the world, but that with that free will we can also do evil. And there are people who can't get that. They feel like, how could God let anything evil happen to the Jews, to the African Americans, to Andrew Goodman, to anyone? And we know that human free will is very powerful, which is one of the things that leads Heschel to believe that it's a partnership, because humans do have the free will and the ability to do evil, and which means that they have that freedom. We're not automatons who just all are good all the time.
So everyone who is bad has bad things happen to them?
Not necessarily.
Because there are good people who have free will and still suffer.
Yeah,
So
lots
how
of
do
good.
how do you explain that? I mean, this person has free will, yeah, ineffable, and
It's what there's another rabbi named Harold Kushner who wrote When Bad Things Happen to People. And how do you explain it? It's one of the mysteries of the world. Why does this happen? Why do these things? If I knew the answer to that, I would not be.
You'd be a prophet.
Yeah, I'd be a prophet. I'm not though. These are the mysteries of the world, and all I can tell you is that Abraham Joshua Heschel was a rabbi who tried to understand them and tried to make sense of them in the way that he best could, which for him was living every day in radical amazement as a person who listened to prophecy and respected it and found value in it, and as a person who marked his Jewish life with through time. Well, one thing he did believe that I want to be sure that we hit upon, in addition with his civil rights and anti-war work, he also was a champion for interfaith relations. And he very, very strongly believed that no one religion had claim over any other religion. He believed that all of us on earth are here because we are chosen.
All men are created equal.
And all living things on earth are here because we are chosen to be living on this earth. He was a champion against anti-Semitism who went to the Vatican, and through his efforts, he convinced the Vatican to remove from Catholic liturgy prayers which blamed the Jews, readings and prayers which blamed the Jews for the death of Jesus, and two, assumed the eventual conversion of Jews. In Catholic liturgy, there were some prayers which stated one day the Jews will all be, will come. I don't know exactly what the does anybody know? At any rate, back in the 60s, he went to the Vatican and he did more for improving Jewish-Catholic relations than almost any other rabbi. He just walked right in, and he was an imposing enough and convincing enough person that he commanded the respect of people from other religions. And if you recall, there was a time when the Pope came out and said, "We're not blaming the Jews anymore for Jesus' death." That and I remember that as a kid. That was because of the efforts of Abraham Joshua Heschel. He went and he made theological arguments, and the Catholic Church ended up agreeing with him and making those changes. That's pretty significant, to make a sea change in an entire, very large world religion that has been praying a certain way and thinking a certain way for a long time. And I think that difference in the Catholic Church led the way, today, for much better relationships between Catholics and Jews and Protestants and Jews today.
Would he be considered reform, or how would you?
Well, he considered himself, he did not label himself. The Jewish Theological Seminary is the seminary of the conservative movement in America. Hebrew Union College, which he originally worked for, is the seminary of the Reform movement in America. The school where he worked at in Berlin was a Reform movement school. However, his ordination was Orthodox ordination. He strictly followed all of the mitzvot. He kept the Shabbat, he kept kosher, he wore a yarmulke every day. So he was a person who did not believe in delineating or labeling or dividing up Jews into different categories.
That's the way I am. People say to me, "Are you Orthodox or conservative?" And I tell them I don't classify myself.
I'm just Jewish. That's interesting because a lot of students today on the college campuses, when you ask them, what denomination are you? Most of them today, most Jewish college students from any element of practice, whether they're Orthodox, conservative, or Reform families, will say, "I'm just Jewish." That is a trend amongst young people today. They do not like being compartmentalized, and as a Hillel director, that's something that we study and that we try to be very attuned to, because we're trying to engage young people in Jewish life, and that compartmentalization for many people is a turnoff. There are those who still, well, I go to the Reform temple, that's my temple, I grew up there, that's where I'm comfortable, but they don't like being compartmentalized or labeled. So, okay, so I'm going to pass out, I'm sorry I don't have the clip, because it was a nice clip. But if you are so inclined, it's called Praying with My Legs. And there's a short clip of it, and you can look it up online. I'm passing out a page of Abraham Joshua Heschel's most famous quotes. These are just a very few of his most famous quotes. And I thought we'd spend the last 10 minutes kind of looking at the quotes, and I'd like to hear from some of you which one speaks to you. So,
You said before his man was parents.
his,
There are many
his sisters died in concentration camps. His father had died when he was 9 years old. And his mother died of a heart attack when the Nazis pounded on their door in Poland. But, you know, the Nazis came, they were pounding on the door, and before she could even open the door, his mother literally died on the spot of a heart attack. His sisters were taken to concentration camps, and his brothers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I have a friend named.
I mean, there's cousins and aunts, and, you know, there are people who made it out, but his immediate family. So, take a look, see if there's a quote that speaks to you, and if it does, let's share it and talk about it a little bit.
When he was in Germany, was he influenced by German philosophers like
Yes, he
Heidegger?
was. Yes, he was. She asked if, while he studied in Germany, was he influenced by German philosophers? And he was. I think that is what, you know, one of the things that caused him to be a very broad thinker, and why he also was motivated to go to university, the secular university. He wanted to know all that he could know. Yes. I think that also speaks to the other quote. A test of a people is how it behaves towards the old. It's easy to love children. Even tyrants and dictators make a point of being fond of children. But the affection and care for the old, the incurable, the helpless, are the true gold mines of a culture. That is one element of this quote. The quote is, few are guilty, but all are responsible.
Well, we do that when it's Yom Kippur, when you are taking upon everyone else's. When you read all the list of sins, you're taking upon everyone else as a community rather than your own.
That's a good point. In Yom Kippur,
Yeah,
the Jewish liturgy, you take on the sins of everyone. But to me, that means we are all responsible. This is just my interpretation. It means that all of us are responsible for correcting those things that make us all, you know, that make those few guilty. So if there's an injustice going on, if we know that there's abuse happening in a nursing home, or we know that there's someone who is being oppressed, it's our responsibility to speak up, to act against it, to try to make a change. That's how I read it.
But you have to be empowered.
Not always, you know, small things. You can donate to a food pantry and be helping people who don't have enough food to eat. And then that's taking responsibility onto yourself to help others. And in terms of power, you know, one thing about being in a democracy, thank God, is we do have power to influence our government in the way that things happen. And when you vote or you participate in the process, you're taking responsibility. When you don't, and you say, why should I vote? It doesn't make any difference. My vote's not going to count. You're reneging on your responsibility, right? Another quote?
Wonder rather than doubt is the root of all knowledge.
Yeah, that's a
To
good one.
question things and wonder about them.
That's kind of what we were talking about with radical amazement. Wonder could be along the same lines of that. Wonder rather than doubt is the root of all knowledge. Good. Another one?
Yeah, the one that speaks to me. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. I don't need to read the whole thing, but it just speaks to me in terms of.
Well, that actually was one of Heschel's concerns in life, was that in Judaism and in particular, because he was a rabbi, he felt that there were rabbis who made the process of Judaism the important thing rather than the practice of Judaism. That, in other words, you know, creating extra prohibitions and adding on to different things, in the end made Judaism less accessible to people. That was one of his, and he followed all the mitzvot. He was kosher, he was shomer Shabbat, he prayed every day, but he felt that there were some rabbis who made it extra hard to be Jewish, that they added things that didn't actually even come from the classical texts and made life harder on
The way
people.
you presented.
It's the way you present it. So, you know, there are probably rabbis who thought that he was a nut job. He had long white hair and a long white beard, and he kind of, you know, he went out with Martin Luther King and other religions, and you know, listen, he was one philosopher of the day. I will thank you all. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Aaron.